Snow clung to her torn pink dress as little Anna staggered into the hospital, clutching her fever-burning baby brother. "Please, save him," she begged, her voice breaking against the indifference of the crowd. The nurse shook her head. No guardian, no papers, no hope. Just as the last light in Anna's eyes began to fade, the glass doors slid open. A battle-worn soldier stepped in, a German shepherd at his side. And with one vow, he turned despair into destiny. The wind off the Spokane River had teeth that night, gnawing through coats and gloves, slipping under doors and rattling the glass panes of Providence Sacred Heart Hospital. Inside, the lobby was no warmer in spirit than the streets outside. The air reeked of disinfectant, sweat, and fear, the sounds of stretcher wheels squealing over tile, voices rising in desperation, the drone of the loudspeaker repeating names with mechanical indifference. Amid the chaos, a small figure stood out like a spark in the storm. Anna Whitlow, 7 years old, clutched her little brother in her thin arms. Her pink dress, once meant for birthdays and sunshine, was now threadbare, its hem torn, its fabric smeared with grime. She looked as though she had run through both snow and fire to reach this place, her tangled hair clinging damply to her temples, her cheeks streaked with tears and soot. In her arms, 2-year-old Theo sagged with fever, his lips cracked, his tiny breaths shallow. Every step she had taken to the hospital had been powered not by strength, but by desperation. And now, standing before the registration desk, her voice rang out in a fragile plea that somehow cut through the din. "Please, please save my brother. He's burning up. I'll pay you back when I grow up, I promise." Her voice, clear yet trembling, carried farther than she realized. The nurse behind the desk, Marla Quinn, lifted her tired eyes. Marla was in her 40s, her hair pinned hastily beneath a blue cap, her face lined not so much with age as with the weight of too many nights like this one. She had long ago learned to filter desperation, to fold it into forms and regulations. Her voice came out flat, the syllables clipped with fatigue. "Where are your papers, sweetheart? Where's your guardian?" Anna shook her head violently, her small frame jolting with the motion. "I don't have any. My parents, my mama's gone. Please, he can't even cry anymore." Marla's eyes flicked down to Theo, catching the mottled flush on his cheeks, the dry lips, the faint moan as his head lolled against Anna's chest. For the briefest instant, compassion cracked her mask, but then rules pressed it shut again. Behind Anna, patients with folders and ID cards waited restlessly, their whispers growing sharp. "No guardian, no insurance, no identification means I can't admit him. Those are the rules. Get a family member here right away." To Marla, it was a policy repeated 100 times. To Anna, it was a door slammed shut in her face. Her knees nearly buckled under Theo's weight as she whispered fiercely into his ear, "It's okay, Theo. I'm here. I won't let anyone hurt you." Her words were more vow than comfort, the last reserve of strength wrung from her tiny body. Silence fell in her heart where hope had been, and in that hollow moment, the glass doors at the entrance hissed open. Silas Hale stepped in from the storm. He was 38, his shoulders broad from years carrying packs and rifles, his gait steady but slightly stiff an old injury from Kandahar that had never quite healed. His face bore the carved lines of both discipline and sorrow, the kind of expressionless calm that soldiers wore after seeing too much. His dark hair was cut close, flecked with early gray at the temples. He wore a heavy army surplus coat, faded but clean, and at his side walked Valor, a German shepherd with a coat of black and tan, his eyes alert, his movements disciplined yet gentle. Valor had been trained as a military working dog, later reassigned as Silas's service animal when the weight of war came home with him. The warmth of the hospital struck Silas after the sting of winter air, but what made him pause was not the heat. It was the sight of a child, dressed in tatters, clutching a brother too weak to cry, and the quiet, shattering sound of a promise no one had cared to hear. He had heard those words, "I'll pay you back." But he had also heard what lay beneath them, the desperate courage of someone far too young to carry such a burden. He strode toward the desk, Valor padding alongside. The crowd unconsciously parted, not out of fear, but out of the authority that radiated from him, an authority born not of wealth but of command learned in deserts and cities overseas. What seems to be the problem here? His voice was low, steady, but carried through the noise like a rifle shot. Marla, caught off guard, shifted uncomfortably. These children need emergency care, sir, but they have no guardian and no documents. According to regulations, I'll be their guardian, Silas cut in. His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. All expenses, all responsibility, I take it on. Now bring me the paperwork around them. Murmurs rippled through the waiting hall. Marla blinked, almost disbelieving, but something in his tone left no room for argument. She reached for the forms with hurried hands. Anna looked up at the man towering over her. Her tears had slowed, her breathing hitched, and in that moment she noticed Valor. The dog stepped closer, pressing his warm body gently against her legs. His eyes, dark and calm, met hers with something almost human. Reassurance, protection, a promise. Without knowing why, Anna's small hand reached down and brushed his fur. Valor did not move except to lean more firmly against her, as if telling her she was no longer alone. As Silas bent to sign his name with a soldier's deliberate hand, the sound of wheels screeched again, and a gurney appeared. A doctor, alerted by the urgency, stepped forward. "We'll take him now." Anna resisted for a heartbeat, clutching Theo tighter. But Silas knelt to her eye level, his weathered face close, his voice gentler than she thought a soldier's voice could be. "They'll help him now. Let them." Something in his tone, firm yet safe, persuaded her. She loosened her grip, and nurses gently lifted Theo onto the gurney. For the first time in hours, the unbearable weight lifted from Anna's arms, though her chest clenched at the sight of the red light above the emergency doors flicking on as they swung shut. Marla Quinn glanced at the girl again. Her professional mask slipped a fraction further as she noticed faint bruises along Anna's wrist, too deliberate to be from play. She made a mental note and quietly tapped out a message to the hospital's social work office. Anna, trembling, found herself standing not in the middle of strangers anymore, but beside the soldier and his dog. She whispered a shaky, "Thank you," though her eyes stayed fixed on the closed emergency doors. Silas did not answer right away. Instead, he placed a steady hand on Valor's collar, his gaze never leaving the child, as if silently vowing that from this moment forward, she and her brother would not face the storm alone. The red light above the emergency doors still glowed when the doctor finally returned. His white coat carried the smell of antiseptic, his stethoscope glinting under the hospital's harsh fluorescent lights. He was a man in his early 50s, salt and pepper hair cropped short, a faint stoop in his shoulders that spoke of long years spent bending over sickbeds. His name tag read Dr. Samuel Whitaker, and though his face was lined with fatigue, his voice was calm, steady, and practiced in the art of delivering hard truths gently. He knelt so his eyes were level with Anna's, not speaking down to her, but across, as one human being to another. "Your brother is stable for now," he said, placing a hand lightly on Anna's trembling shoulder. "But his condition is not just fever. He's suffering from prolonged malnutrition. His immune system is weak, very weak. He'll need weeks of treatment, maybe longer, and special care to recover." Anna's lips quivered. For a moment she looked as though she would crumple into tears again. But Silas's hand, steady and warm on her small back, kept her upright. "I'll take care of it," Silas said firmly, his voice a pledge that left no room for doubt. "From now on, these children won't have to beg for care." "Not while I'm here." Dr. Whitaker studied him for a brief moment, his eyes narrowing in professional scrutiny. He had seen many men speak with conviction and then vanish the next day when costs mounted. But there was something unshakable in the soldier's gaze, a gravity that made the doctor nod. "Very well. We'll admit the boy. But this is not just a bill to pay. It's a fight. A long one." As the doctor walked away, Anna loosened the grip she had on her small cloth pouch, and something slipped free, landing face down on the tile. Silas bent to pick it up before the crowd could trample it. When he turned it over, his breath caught. It was a faded photograph, corners frayed. The image of a woman with gentle eyes and a smile that carried both resilience and weariness. Grace Whitlow. The name came unbidden, though he wasn't sure from where. He felt a tug in the back of his memory, something blurred, unreachable, like smoke rising from an old battlefield. He didn't hand the photo back immediately. For a long moment, he simply stared, unable to shake the strange familiarity that clawed at his chest. Anna reached out quickly, snatching it back, clutching it to her heart with the urgency of one who had so few treasures left in the world. "That's my mama," she whispered, her eyes sharp with protectiveness, as though daring him to judge. Silas only nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to ask more, but the words didn't come. Instead, Valor shifted against his leg, the dog's nose bumping Silas's thigh, a quiet reminder to breathe. Valor had been with Silas since the army doctors had signed the papers releasing him from active service. Once trained to sniff out explosives in distant deserts, the German Shepherd had become something else entirely, a lifeline. At home, in the silent hours when nightmares dragged Silas back to alleyways and gunfire, Valor would nudge his head against his chest, pressing close until the soldier's heart slowed again. Tonight, the dog repeated the gesture, as if sensing the storm in his handler's thoughts. Anna noticed. For the first time since entering the hospital, a flicker of something soft, almost a smile touched her lips. He tells you what to do?" she asked shyly. Silas allowed a faint grin to break his stern face. "Sometimes he thinks he's the sergeant and I'm the private." As if to prove the point, Valor nudged him again, harder this time, and Silas obeyed, sitting on the metal chair against the wall. Anna giggled, a sound that seemed out of place yet desperately needed in the sterile hallway. It was at that moment a new figure approached. She was a woman in her late 30s, her blonde hair tied back neatly, glasses perched on her nose, carrying a clipboard thick with notes. Clara Jensen, a social worker assigned to the hospital's night shift, introduced herself with a soft but professional smile. Her years of work showed in her eyes, firm, perceptive, yet touched with a compassion she had learned to guard carefully. "I need to ask a few questions," she said gently, kneeling so she didn't loom over Anna. "Who looks after you when your mama's not here?" Anna's gaze fell to the floor. Her arms tightened protectively around the photograph. She didn't answer, but her silence was eloquent. Clara turned her attention to Silas. "She's been seen on the streets selling scratch-off tickets late at night. That was reported weeks ago. The man with her, Trent Malloy, is listed as her stepfather. Do you know him?" Silas shook his head. The name meant nothing, yet the way Clara said it left a foul taste in his mouth. Clara's voice lowered, steady but grim. "He's been flagged before, known for drinking, for leaving the children unsupervised. But cases slip through the cracks without hard evidence. If he shows up here, things could get difficult." Anna finally spoke, her voice small but hard as flint. "He doesn't care about us. He only wants the money." She didn't elaborate further, but her knuckles whitened around the photo of her mother until it seemed the paper might tear. Clara reached out but didn't touch, only let her voice carry weight. "You're safe for now. We'll keep notes. But it may come down to a guardian willing to fight for you in court." Her eyes flicked toward Silas, lingering for a beat. Then she rose and walked away, her pen already scratching on the clipboard. Silas leaned back, the hospital ceiling lights glaring down at him. His pulse was uneven, the photograph's image burning into his mind, the name Trent Malloy echoing with menace, and the fragile trust in Anna's eyes pressing on his conscience. He was a man who had once sworn oaths to protect strangers in foreign lands. Now, standing in this hallway in Spokane, it seemed the true battle had only just begun. The hospital had quieted into the uneasy calm that always followed midnight, when the chaos of the ER slowed, but the tension never truly eased. Silas sat in the hallway outside Theo's room, Valor lying stretched at his boots, ears twitching at every distant echo. Anna dozed in the chair beside him, clutching her mother's photograph as though it were both shield and anchor. The hum of fluorescent lights and the faint hiss of a heating vent filled the silence. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt safe. Then the automatic doors at the far end of the corridor hissed open. A man walked in with the kind of confidence that made people step aside without knowing why. He was tall but gaunt, his shoulders narrow beneath a wrinkled flannel shirt. His hair was unkempt, the brown strands matted with oil, and his jaw was shadowed with the stubble of someone who hadn't shaved in days. His eyes were the worst part restless, bloodshot, gleaming with a smile that never reached them. This was Trent Malloy, 37, a man who had once been a mechanic but had long since traded wrenches for whiskey bottles. Life had bent him into something half snarling, half scheming, a man whose only loyalty was to his own needs. "Evening," Trent said with a grin that carried no warmth. His voice rasped like gravel, heavy with the sour tang of alcohol. "I heard my kids were here. Poor little things. Thought I'd come to take them home?" Anna's eyes snapped open as though she had been burned. The photograph slipped from her lap as she bolted upright, pressing herself tight against Silas's side. Her fingers clutched his sleeve with desperate strength. Valor rose instantly, body stiff, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. The German shepherd's hackles bristled, teeth glinting beneath curled lips. Silas stood slowly, his full height casting a shadow across the corridor, his stance steady but coiled. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "They're not going anywhere with you tonight." Trent's smile faltered for just a breath, then returned, thinner, tighter. "And who might you be? Some stranger who thinks he knows better than family?" He stepped forward, but Valor moved first, planting himself squarely between Trent and Anna, growl rising to a sharp bark that echoed off the sterile walls. Trent froze, his grin slipping again, this time into something darker. "Back down your mutt," he hissed. Silas didn't move. The dog's smarter than most men I've met. He knows danger when he sees it. The tension broke only when two hospital security officers, summoned by Valor's bark, arrived. Silas gave clear, precise instructions, his military tone leaving no space for argument, and within minutes, security had Trent escorted from the floor. Still, the encounter had left the air charged with unease. Once Anna was calm again, Silas placed a call to Ava Brooks, a lawyer he had trusted since his discharge. Ava was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed with short-cropped auburn hair, and a reputation for fighting the kind of cases most lawyers avoided. She had grown up in a working-class Spokane family and carried into her practice both the grit of her upbringing and the unshakable belief that the law, though flawed, could be bent toward justice if pushed hard enough. At 2 in the morning, Ava's voice came through the line, steady despite the hour. "If Malloy's already trying to reclaim them, we'll need emergency guardianship paperwork filed today. I'll draft it. Keep security close. Don't let him near the kids." "I won't," Silas replied. His tone was clipped, but Ava knew it wasn't dismissal. It was the soldier in him, already making tactical plans. Later that day, as Anna finally slept under the watchful gaze of a nurse, Silas decided he needed answers. He couldn't fight shadows, and right now, Malloy was little more than a shadow. He asked a cab to take him north into Hilliard, one of Spokane's oldest working-class neighborhoods. The streets bore the scars of neglect paint peeling from narrow houses, chain-link fences sagging under years of rust, children's toys left half-buried in snow. Silas walked with Valor trotting close, the dog's presence drawing wary but curious glances from the few neighbors outside. He stopped at a small duplex where the Whitlows had last lived. There he met Dolores Pike, a retired seamstress in her 70s. Her hair was silver, her back slightly hunched, but her eyes were sharp and her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen more than most. She lived next door to Grace and her children, and when Silas introduced himself, she seemed to measure him for a long moment before nodding. "Grace was a good woman," Dolores said, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. "Hard-working, always smiling for those kids, even when life gave her nothing to smile about. But the day Malloy came, her light dimmed. He was no husband, only a burden. I heard the shouting through the walls, the bottles breaking. I wanted to help, but Grace never wanted trouble. She always said the kids came first." Silas listened in silence, Valor sitting obediently at his heel. Something inside him twisted when Dolores pulled a worn shoebox from her shelf. Inside was a folded clipping from a Yakima newspaper, dated more than a decade earlier. The headline read, "Factory Fire Averted by Heroic Worker." The photo was blurred, smoke-stained, but unmistakable. A young woman with soot-streaked cheeks and fierce, determined eyes, dragging open a jammed emergency door, while others fled. Silas's breath caught, the edges of memory snapping into focus like glass reassembling. He had been there that day, a visiting guardsman coordinating local disaster drills when the blaze erupted. Trapped in the haze, coughing on smoke, he had felt a small, desperate figure push the door free, her strength greater than her size. He had never known her name. Until now, Grace Whitlow, the mother of the children asleep in a hospital bed under his watch. The woman who had once saved his life. He stood frozen, the clipping trembling in his hands. The years of buried memory suddenly alive again. Valor pressed against his leg, grounding him in the present. Silas swallowed hard, his voice rough when he finally spoke. I owed her once. Looks like I still do. Rain hammered against the hospital windows like a relentless drum, the storm swelling into the kind of night that unsettled even the most hardened hearts. Silas had barely returned from Hilliard when the call came from security. A man had been seen staggering through the hospital's side entrance. He knew before the guard finished speaking who it was. Trent Malloy burst into the pediatric wing, drenched, his shirt plastered to his thin frame, his eyes wild with alcohol and rage. His voice, hoarse and slurred, echoed down the corridor. Anna! Theo, you're coming with me now! Anna froze in terror, her small hands clutching Silas's sleeve so tightly her knuckles went white. Valor was faster than thought. His bark shattered the quiet, sharp and commanding, the sound of a trained guardian on alert. The German shepherd planted himself in front of the children, ears flat, muscles taut, teeth flashing in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. Silas moved at the same time, stepping squarely between Trent and the children. His voice was steady, colder than the storm outside. You're done, Malloy. Trent lunged, but security officers, already closing in, wrestled him to the ground. For a moment, the corridor was a blur of shouts, Valor's snarls, and Anna's frightened sobs. Then just as quickly, silence fell. Trent was hauled away in handcuffs, his curses fading into the night rain. Anna collapsed against Silas, trembling, her tears soaking the sleeve of his coat. The arrest pushed events forward with brutal speed. By morning, Ava Brooks had filed an emergency petition for guardianship. The courthouse in downtown Spokane smelled faintly of damp stone as rainwater pooled at its steps. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Ava arrived in her sharp navy suit, her auburn hair pulled back, her eyes alert as if she had slept only minutes but lived off determination. She carried a thick folder of documents and a small clipping carefully sealed in plastic, the piece of newsprint that tied Grace Whitlow to a factory fire long ago. Silas sat quietly at her side, his posture straight, his gaze steady, while Anna clutched Valor's fur in the waiting bench, drawing comfort from the dog's solid warmth. The courtroom itself was stark wooden benches, polished with years of use, a high ceiling that magnified every whisper. At the center sat Judge Eleanor Brandt, a woman in her early 60s with short silver hair and a reputation for measured fairness. Her voice carried weight not because it was loud, but because it was precise, each word falling like a gavel in itself. The hearing began with testimony. Nurse Marla Quinn stepped forward first. Her weary eyes softened as she described the night Anna had begged for help, the bruises she had noticed on the child's wrist, and the quiet way Anna had whispered promises no child should have to make. Next was Dr. Samuel Whitaker, who explained Theo's medical condition, prolonged malnutrition, weak immunity, the neglect that had brought him near death. His tone was clinical, but beneath it ran the unmistakable anger of a man forced too often to patch wounds left by cruelty. Dolores Pike, the elderly neighbor, leaned heavily on her cane as she testified. Her voice trembled with age but not with doubt. She spoke of nights when she heard bottles shattering, Grace's muffled sobs, in Trent's tirades. Grace was strong, she said firmly, but even the strongest woman breaks when she's alone against a wolf. Then came Miss Ruth Larkin, Anna's elementary school teacher. She was a woman in her late 30s with gentle brown eyes and a nervous habit of pushing her glasses up her nose. She described Anna as bright but often exhausted, her hands sometimes red from the cold mornings, selling tickets outside the grocery store. Her testimony painted the picture of a child fighting battles far beyond the classroom. When the time came for Anna herself to speak, the courtroom stilled. The little girl stood slowly, her torn pink dress replaced with borrowed clothes still too big for her frame. She trembled, her eyes darting toward Trent, seated in cuffs beside his attorney, his stare like poison. But when she turned to Silas, who met her gaze with steady encouragement, something inside her steadied. She lifted her small arm, pulling back her sleeve to reveal the faint scar etched across her skin. Her voice, though shaky, carried through the hushed room. He did this. He poured hot soup on me because I spilled food. And he said if I told anyone, he'd do worse to my brother. Tears welled, but she did not break. I don't want to go back. I want to stay with Mr. Hale, with Silas. A hush swept the room, heavier than the storm outside. Even the judge's hands paused in their notes. Then Ava stood, her voice deliberate and resonant. She placed the newspaper clipping on the evidence stand. Your Honor, this is more than a custody battle. This is legacy. Grace Whitlow was the woman who once risked her life in a Yakima factory fire to save others. Among those she saved was Silas Hale, who now stands ready to protect her children. If ever there were a case where justice and fate intertwined, it is this. Judge Brandt studied the clipping, her expression unreadable. At last, she removed her glasses, wiped them slowly, and fixed her gaze on Trent. Her voice was cool as rain. This court finds sufficient grounds for emergency guardianship. Custody is hereby granted to Silas Hale. Mr. Malloy, your parental rights are suspended pending criminal trial for child abuse and neglect. The gavel struck, final and unyielding. Anna's breath rushed out in relief. Valor pressed his head against her arm, grounding her as the storm outside finally began to ebb. Silas reached down, his calloused hand brushing gently over her hair. You're safe now, he whispered. And for the first time, Anna dared to believe him. The first hints of spring had begun to stir in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, though patches of snow still clung stubbornly to the shaded edges of pine groves. A month had passed since the courtroom gavel had fallen, and the cabin Silas once considered nothing more than a shelter now carried the warmth of a home. The place had been built decades earlier by his grandfather, a modest log house with cedar beams, a stone fireplace, and windows that overlooked the lake. For years, Silas had returned here only to sleep, the silence pressing down like a second skin. But now laughter threaded through the walls, and the air was filled not with ghosts but with life. Theo, once pale and hollow-eyed, now toddled across the living room floor, his cheeks round and rosy, his giggle bright as he clutched a stuffed bear almost as big as he was. He had taken to Valor with the unshakable trust only a small child could give, pulling at the dog's ears, clambering over his back as if he were both horse and fortress. Valor endured it all with patient dignity, his eyes half-lidded, only occasionally giving Silas a look that seemed to say, "This is not in my training manual." Anna had changed too. The haunted tightness in her small face had eased, replaced with the concentration of a child rediscovering her own world. At the wide oak table by the window, she sat hunched over colored pencils, her brow furrowed as she sketched sunflowers and mountains, sometimes adding Valor's pointed ears peeking from behind trees. She spoke more freely now, her laughter ringing out when Theo toppled into a pile of cushions, or when Silas, fumbling in the kitchen, burned a batch of pancakes. One afternoon, she presented Silas with a drawing. It was not polished, its lines uneven, its colors bright and a little wild, but it held a kind of truth no fine art could capture. 4 stick figures stood in front of a square house. One tall man, one dog with oversized ears, and 2 children holding his hands. Beneath it, written in careful block letters, was a single word: family. Silas stared at the paper, his throat tightening. He glanced at the wall above the fireplace, where a large oil painting in Inheritance, costly but cold, had hung untouched for years. Slowly he lifted it down, his hands almost reverent. In its place he pinned Anna's drawing, the crayon colors vivid against the wood. Below it, the silver-framed photograph of Grace Whitlow rested on the mantel. Silas's gaze lingered on the gentle smile of the woman who had once saved his life, then on the children she had left behind. In the quiet of that moment, he whispered, "I'll always protect them, Grace. Always." Valor shifted beside him, resting his head on Silas's leg, as if sealing the vow with silent approval. The dog had become the unseen pillar of the household. At night he lay across the doorway of the children's room, a living barrier against nightmares. When Anna startled awake from dreams of shouting and broken glass, Valor pressed close, nudging her gently until she drifted back to sleep, her hand curled into his fur. For Theo, Valor became a bridge to joy, bringing him his bear when he cried, nudging the toy across the floor until giggles replaced tears. Silas, who had once relied on Valor only as a balm for his own haunted nights, found that the dog's role had expanded. On their walks along the lakeside trails, when Silas taught Anna the deep breathing exercises he had learned from Army therapists, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Valor matched their steps exactly, his steady pace turning into a metronome of calm. The dog was no longer only a companion, he was the quiet thread stitching them all together. Life was not perfect. Silas still wrestled with the weight of memory, waking some nights to the echo of distant explosions. Anna sometimes froze when thunder cracked, her body stiff with old fears, and Theo clung too tightly when strangers came too close. But in those moments, they found refuge in one another. The house breathed with them, its logs creaked not in emptiness, but in warmth. The fire in the hearth reflected in eyes filled with new hope. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the roof, Silas sat at his old oak desk, a letter spread before him. His handwriting was steady, bold, though his hand trembled slightly as he folded the note around a yellowed newspaper clipping. He sealed it carefully, addressed to the memorial board of the Yakima textile factory. Inside, he had written of Grace Whitlow, of her courage, of the day she had pulled him and others from the fire. He asked, no, insisted, that her name be etched into the roll of heroes, where it always belonged. When he set down the pen, the cabin was quiet except for the soft crackle of fire and the steady breathing of children asleep upstairs. Valor stirred once, then settled again, his head heavy against Silas's boot. Silas leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time in many years, the silence did not feel like loneliness. It felt like home. In the end, this was not only the story of a soldier, a loyal dog, and 2 children who found a home. It was the story of how love and courage can break the cycle of fear, and how even the smallest act of kindness can echo for a lifetime. Grace once saved a life in the fire, and through Silas and Valor, that gift of protection lived on for her children. Let this story remind us that we all have the power to stand between the helpless and the storm. Sometimes being a guardian is not about blood, but about choosing to protect when it matters most. If you believe every child deserves a safe home, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what this story meant to you, or how loyalty has touched your own life. And if you were moved by Anna, Theo, Silas, and Valor, please like this video, follow and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of hope and healing.